current crisis. My name is Elena Baglioni. I'm a senior lecturer in global supply chain management at Queen Mary, University of London. And it's a pleasure to for us to join this to host this event organized by our research center, the Center of Labor and Global Production, which is a lively research center between the School of Business and Geography housed at Queen Mary. And I'm particularly happy to host this event because this event has been indeed long overdue. So today's presentation wishes to be a kind of sort of follow-up to a larger event that took place, a larger workshop that took place last June in London at Queen Mary on social reproduction within and beyond production. You can find the details on that on the center webpage, and hopefully very soon from next week, even a link to YouTube recording of single presentations. Almost after a year, not just in time for once. So participants to this event included Stefania Barca, Gagi Bhattacharya, Silvia Federici, Alessandra Mezzadri, Bridget O'Laughlin, Claire Quentin, and Sigrid Vertmonen. And today's speakers were also invited to participate at the event, but couldn't join for different reasons. So it's really a pleasure to finally be able to listen to them. And of course, when we organized this event, we could never foresee the present situation, the spread of the pandemic, the massive capitalist crisis, and the kind of sudden exposure of social reproduction, the unexpected unveiling of the centrality of the home, of the household, of care work, of key work, which are not so hidden anymore all of a sudden. So I think this today makes today's event really timely and important. Just a few technical communications before we start, before we move to the presentation. So it's the first time we hold an online event of this sort, or of any sort actually. So we're not very expert. I'm certainly not. So please bear with us should you experiment problems with the video. Hopefully you will be able to listen most of the presentation. So if you encounter any problem, the suggestion I've been told is to try to leave the room and to try to get in with a different browser, and it looks like Chrome is the one that would work best. But there are two of my friends and colleagues, Liam Campling and Amit Rai, that are working behind the scene, and hopefully, I hope they would be able to sort out technical issues or sort out the questions at the end. So the format, the two presentations will take up around 40 minutes and will be one after the other. Then after 40 minutes, we will take 10 minutes of break, and then we will resume with questions open for the public. Shall we go with Brenna? So the first presentation is Brenna. Brenna Bhandar is reader in law and critical theory at SOAS, University of London. She's author of Colonial Lives of Property, Law, Land and Racial Regimes of Ownership, co-editor with John Golder-Hiller of Plastic Materialities, Politics, Legality and Metamorphosis in the Work of Catherine Malabou, and co-editor of the forthcoming Revolutionary Feminism, Conversations on Collective Action and Radical Thought, co-editor with Rafik Zidar.
Okay, thanks so much, Elena, for organizing this and also for bearing with us and all of the delays that have happened and now dealing with this very strange situation in which we find ourselves. So I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint and just launch right into my presentation. So I'm going to sort of go over very quickly a kind of just some basic points about what social reproduction feminism is, and then think about some of the critiques of social reproduction feminism from a critical race perspective, and then I want to look at some of the contact points between some of the critical race feminism and the social reproduction feminism. And I'm going to end by thinking about two ideas that relate to what I really want to focus on, which has to do with the material infrastructures in which socially reproductive work takes place. I want to think about the home in particular, and I want to think about the ideas or throw some ideas on the table. One is sort of porosity and porousness, and the other idea I want to think about is immunity. So that's sort of what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes or so. Okay, so just beginning with social reproduction feminism. So this emerges in the 1970s in the scholarship and activism of feminists who exposed how Marx's definition of productive labor failed to recognize the reproductive labor of women in the domestic sphere as being essential to capitalism. The failure to valorize the labor involved in reproducing the life of the worker and producing future workers reinforced the inferior status of domestic labor and moreover obscured the way in which capitalist social relations created particular subjectivities of the housewife and a particular ideal of femininity that were central to women's oppression. Domestic work thus performed a dual function. It was value producing for processes of capitalist accumulation, while it simultaneously naturalized its producer as inevitably suited to non-productive work in the home that was deemed to have no value. The theoretical basis for this argument was developed by Silvia Federici, Leopoldina Fortunati, Maria Rosa della Costa, Selma James, and others, emerging primarily out of an Italian Marxist feminist scene that was influenced by the work of Tronti and the idea of operaismo, but also cognizant of their limits when it came to gender. And it's important to bear in mind that the theoretical work underpinned an international political movement, the Wages for Housework campaign, whose name reflects their primary political demand. Social reproduction feminists sought to redefine the category of labor to include domestic work, and they sought to subvert or even destroy the production of a feminine subjectivity and the category of woman that naturalized women's status and identities as housewives. Now, the International Wages for Housework campaign was divisive among feminists on many fronts. From the 1970s onwards, there were critiques of the movement and the theory underlying it by feminists such as Angela Davis, and subsequently work by critical race feminists who sought to complicate the status of women's labor. Let me just change the slide. Okay, Angela Davis argued that simply giving a wage to women would not desexualize and degender domestic labor, nor would it deal with the oppressive nature of the work itself. On this latter point, who would be satisfied with a wage for work that never ends? Something that we feel quite acutely in the present moment. More significantly, Davis argued that the Wages for Housework campaign could not and did not account for the history of Black women's paid and unpaid labor in the domestic sphere, both in the US and elsewhere. And there is a long and vital argument here about Black women's reproductive labor under slavery and its legacies, which I don't have time to discuss, but I just wanted to note. Davis drew attention to the long history of Black women's paid labor in the home and the continued prevalence of Black women domestic workers whose paid labor was sorely undervalued and exploited in the post-slavery era. In Women, Race, Class, published in 1981, taking the destruction of Black family life under apartheid South Africa as her example, Davis showed how racial capitalism renders futile the argument that women ought to be paid wages for housework based on capitalism's internal logic. In other words, the extreme exploitation of Black male workers and I'm quoting, the characterization of African women as superfluous appendages, end quote, that saw their banishment from urban and industrial centers under laws of segregation, showed that Black domestic life itself was deemed totally irrelevant to the operation of capitalism under apartheid. Now, a third and related point made by feminists of color is that the domestic sphere is an ambivalent space. For people of color and their children living in racist societies, the home has long functioned as a space of rest, refuge, and resistance, as Patricia Hill Collins and Bell Hooks, amongst others, have noted. Now, despite these differences in a social reproduction feminist approach to the question of labor and value, and the critiques rendered by the likes of Angela Davis, I think that over time, some points of contact between these two trajectories of feminism have emerged. For instance, both Angela Davis and Silvia Federici emphasize the common emphasize the human community of producers and the way in which care work in the home, of course, far exceeds the reproduction of the worker for capitalist forms of labor in terms of what it means and what it produces. Not every aspect of domestic work can be characterized as labor, and not all affection and affect can be grasped through thinking about its status as just another commodity. Affect and empathy, along with solidarity, are essential ingredients in a struggle for liberation, something that Avtar Bra has written about. So the home and the domestic sphere have always functioned as a site for resistance. The collectivization, socialization, and the decommodification of care work requires an anti-capitalist reconceptualization of valorization itself. And for Federici, this is what she means by the phrase revolution at point zero. We might think about how abolition feminism, to think about some other contact points, which is a way of understanding Angela Davis's kind of feminist politics, also focuses on alternate forms of valorization as central to thinking about the meaning of freedom. It's interesting in thinking about this far more expansive notion of what counts, what we mean by social reproduction, to think about the links between as Davis notes in this comment, that a more expensive awareness of women's reproductive labor can also help us to more deeply grasp the historical significance of women domestic workers' participation in such movements as the anti-past struggles in South Africa and the bus boycott in Montgomery, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the point that she's trying to make, which is also something that Silvia Federici has come to write about, is that the struggle for the recognition of the value and the revalorization of this kind of labor, paid labor, is not mutually exclusive from the struggle to also decommodify this work and to revalorize it with a different understanding of social relations in mind. So just to talk a little bit more about the points of contact. So one of the points that we see in both of these different trajectories of feminist thought and activism is that focusing solely on labor, be that paid or unpaid, is not sufficient to either degenderize socially reproductive work or to bring this essential work of producing and reproducing life into our understandings of how value is created. Another point of contact is that a much more expansive understanding of the infrastructures of reproductive labor and the conditions under which we reproduce life must necessarily be part of how we understand social reproduction. So in thinking about the question of value when it comes to reproductive work, there is a twofold challenge. On the one hand, to give this work value and visibility and a central place in how we organize and understand social relations and the economy. So here we can think of the fight against the gross levels of exploitation of workers who are cleaning the hospitals, of nursery staff, of workers in the service sector in the gig economy. And second, the second fold of this challenge is to radically transform the concept of value itself and to move beyond the limits of commodified care work, as I mentioned a moment ago. Now, in thinking of reproductive work in this much broader sense that takes into account the conditions under which this reproduction of life takes place, I want to focus on two concepts. One is the porousness of the body, of the boundary between the care work and the place where that care work is done. And the other is the idea of immunity, both in a biological, medical sense and a juridical one. We can think about these two concepts by considering how the crisis in care work, massively intensified by SARS-CoV-2, is enwrapped in another and similarly long-standing crisis in the conditions under which care work takes place. By conditions, I want to think specifically about one particular aspect of the material infrastructures of care work, and that is the home. The home in this time of lockdown has in many ways become the true epicenter of the pandemic. With the injunction to shelter in place, and to stay at home as the primary means of controlling the spread of the virus, one's very ability to protect one's health and life has become entirely dependent on having adequate shelter. That's not really the right slide. Hold on a second. No, I don't seem to have it. Anyways, I continue. Okay. And while this is always true, this fact has become ever more urgent in the context of the pandemic. Now, the home as an ambivalent site, a place of both refuge and exploitation, as I mentioned a few moments ago, has been thoroughly explored in a recent blog post by Catherine Baker on the Disorder of Things blog, which is actually what I wanted to have on a slide, but it didn't make it up there. So the quotation reads as follows. Homes themselves will be worsening the health of those living in conditions which are too cramped to distance or isolate themselves safely, those suffering the mental health consequences of not having private space or guaranteed access to the open air, and those whose housing depends on informal agreements with arbitrary or discriminatory landlords in the midst of a global economic shutdown. All these circumstances, which can be seen as structural violence, are more likely to affect individuals who have been racialized into stigmatized minority groups, queer and trans people with limited access to employment protections, and migrants kept out of stable housing by the enforcement of the everywhere or polymorphic border, end quote. So the state of one's housing and one's access to housing affects one's very ability to defend oneself from the virus. And I want to go a bit further here and explore how the state and the quality of one's shelter has an impact on one's health, and specifically one's immune system. To cut quite quickly to the chase, I want to consider the double meaning of the word immunity here, both in its juridical sense as freedom from tax or a financial liability, and in its biomedical sense as being resistant to or protected from a particular disease. Now, this crisis, like the financial crisis of 2008, has laid bare the seeming untouchability of property and real estate, and here we will focus specifically on rent as one primary component of rentier capitalism more broadly. A long-standing political demand of feminist organizers, housing and affordable rent have become crucial to people's ability to withstand severe and, in some cases, lethal illness. And here we can see this quotation from Lisa Adkins and Martin Konings from a blog post called COVID Life and the Asset, which refers to a forthcoming book on asset capitalism that they've written. The state of affairs plays itself out in what have rapidly become familiar day-to-day rhythms as non-essential white-collar professionals work safely from home, all the while receiving their paychecks. Essential workers deliver food and other necessities to their door, collecting their garbage, ensure their Wi-Fi keeps running, and if they fall sick, care for them. And we've obviously seen over the last weeks the lethal consequences for frontline workers who have not been given proper protections, of course, but the overlap between racialized workers in particular and of course class inequity and poverty. So another quotation, this is perhaps most clearly expressed in how relationships to assets and especially to residential property are central in shaping how COVID lives can and are being lived. This is not least because the lockdown, social distancing, stay-at-home and shelter-in-place mandates of government precisely assume access to private residential property. And here, home ownership is critical because it marks a divide between those who are able to lock down, stay at home and stay safe, and those who cannot. So just emphasizing the central role of ownership in this pandemic. Now, the very material infrastructure of the home itself is part of the conditions in which the reproduction of life takes place. And we know that the boundary between ourselves and the environment in which we live, the air we breathe, the place we go to rest, to recuperate from work, to shore ourselves up, is porous. This is less of a boundary between ourselves and the environments in which we live than it is a biome. The liabilities of racialized and gendered inequality compute quite directly to one's vulnerability to illness, and this virus is no exception. The hallmarks of bad accommodation, poor ventilation, mold, cramped and overcrowded conditions, a lack of light, affect one's immune system and immune response to everything from stress to viruses. And it's interesting that from the 19th century onwards in this country, and I'm sure others, that the state's response to poverty, pandemics, and housing were all very closely intertwined. Now, it's clear that people of color, Black and Asian people in particular in the UK, and Black communities in the US are dying at vastly higher rates than people racialized as white, and that this has a clear relationship to class and wealth disparities. Now, I want to just switch course just by way of conclusion. I know my time must be up. To think about what immunity from a potentially lethal illness means in this moment. How does the juridical idea of immunity relate to the biomedical concept of immunity, one's immune system, as a system of defense that protects oneself? As anyone with an autoimmune disorder knows, one's immune system can also undermine one's ability to function in the world by attacking the body. Exogenous factors, racism, sexism, poverty, exploitation, set the body on a war footing with itself. And again, we can think about the porosity of the body. It is not possible to imagine the body as defensible, as in immune from the ways in which white supremacy and patriarchy operate to get under our skin, to get into our heads, to wound us, to enrage us. And that's why women are more likely to suffer from autoimmune illness. Obviously, that is not a scientific view. Capitalism, of course, operates against attempts to mitigate, because to deal with an overreactive immune system, one must rest, one must not work, one must eat nourishing food that takes time to prepare, one must have time to artfully and creatively engage in socially reproductive labors. The home has become the epicenter of the pandemic. Immunity in its juridical sense, freedom from liability for the burdens of rent, freedom from eviction, freedom from the banks, freedom from private property, is at its core the path to resilience in the face of a debilitating and sometimes lethal illness. Thanks.
Thank you, Brenna. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. I will now move to present the second presentation. The second paper jointly presented by Taha and Sara Salem. Taha is an assistant professor at the American University in Cairo, grounded in anti-racist socialist feminism. Her research focuses on how the organization of race, class, and gender is a fundamental way of forming social hierarchies through law. She has written on international law and empire, labor rights, gender relations, care work, and social reproduction in the Middle East. She's interested in the politics of coloniality across time through exploring traditional and alternative archives, oral histories, and literary narratives. Sara Salem is an assistant professor in sociology at the London School of Economics. Her research interests include political sociology, post-colonial studies, Marxist theory, and global histories of empire. She has recently published articles on undergraduates in Egypt in the journal Science, on Frantz Fanon on Egypt's post-colonial states in interventions, a journal of post-colonial studies, and on Nasserism in Egypt through the lens of haunting in the Middle East critique. Her recently published book with Cambridge University Press is entitled Anti-Colonial Afterlives in Egypt, The Politics of Hegemony, and they present on vignettes on social reproduction, gender, empire, and capital in an Egyptian sense. May, up to you.
Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Elena, for organizing this, and thanks everyone for joining us. So today we want to bring in conversations surrounding social reproduction to the context of Egypt at different moments in its colonial and post-colonial history. So in the longer paper, we critically analyze the intersecting social structures that come together around social reproduction, building on work by both Black feminist tradition and the Italian autonomist feminist tradition. These traditions have challenged, as Brenna has just shown, the tendency of orthodox Marxist scholarship to ignore the importance of unpaid labor, often done by women, to the functioning of capitalism. As such, social reproduction as a theory made a crucial intervention in Marxist theorizing. Nevertheless, its emphasis on gender as the primary means of understanding social reproduction means that it can at times be read as a maybe narrow approach to the question of unpaid labor and capitalist exploitation. At the same time, while there's a rich feminist scholarship on Egypt as well, but whenever motherhood, care work, or reproduction are interrogated, this interrogation is not always done through a critique of capitalism, but rather in relation to questions of culture and society, or in relation to the problematic binary of tradition and modernity. In engaging with these themes, we focus on two novels that have depicted social reproduction in different ways and at different moments in Egypt's post-colonial history. Through these novels, Latifa Zayed's Open Door and Sonallah Brahim's Zed, we show how social reproduction was embedded within debates around race, capital, patriarchy, and post-colonial modernity, and how it seeped into the politics of every day. Finally, we end with some reflections on social reproduction in Egypt and the Global South more broadly in light of the global pandemic. So just to give you a bit of context, Egypt was colonized by Britain in 1882 until its independence in 1952 through a military coup that announced a new order of post-colonial modernity and continued under the reign of Nasser and the ideology of Arab socialism. As we show later, gender was central in assembling this new post-colonial modernity where women's work and presence in the public sphere would complete this new anti-colonial, socialist, and modern image of the country. However, contestation over the meaning of Egyptian womanhood had already started during the colonial period and became part of the debate surrounding domesticity, culture, and modernity that developed in the late 19th century with British colonialism. Through the figure of the ignorant and oppressed Muslim woman in Egyptian families, British colonial officials questioned the moral and political authority of Egyptians for self-governance. Remarkably, these various colonial tropes on Egyptian womanhood were actually adopted later by nationalist elites, constructing a new vision for a modern and independent Middle East. At the turn of the century, we find courses on washing, ironing, sewing, cooking, that were being offered to women across all of the social classes. Through this process, as Silvia Federici shows, the body was becoming for women under capitalism what the factory has been for male-waged workers, the primary ground of their exploitation and resistance. At the same time, the normalization of sexuality exclusively within the parameter bourgeois companionate marriage, along with organizing reproduction within a framework of social reform, has often effaced women's centrality to reproduction, as Omnia Shakri has argued. Women were effectively excluded from all debates on birth control, for example, until the middle of the 20th century. Today, we're interested in scoping out this constantly negotiated relationship between life and labor through looking at social reproduction in Egyptian history. So during the 30s and 40s, social reproduction came to be defined by the parameters of colonial capital, as well as domestication of colonial myths on the nature of Eastern women. Modern motherhood was essential for the collective's dream of independence that juxtaposed middle-class respectability against working-class immorality. The celebrated feminist novel, The Open Door, written by Latifa Zayed in 1960 and its later rendition into a film directed by Henry Barakat in 1963, links domestic work with immorality and promiscuity. The novel was written at the height of Nasser's popularity, a few years after the nationalization of the Suez Canal, but it was set during the anti-colonial struggles of the 40s, right before the popularly supported 1952 coup that ousted the British from the country. So in the novel, Layla and her cousin Assam are in love. Assam gradually disappoints her with his violent possessiveness and his cowardice when he doesn't volunteer in the people's resistance against the British in Port Said. Layla loses total faith in love when she sees him being seduced by Sayyida, the sexualized and immoral domestic worker. Indeed, press reports and court records during this period portrayed all domestic workers, and I quote, as fallen women or thieves who took up domestic service as a cover. In one op-ed piece, all female domestic workers were deemed ignorant about everything except stealing and causing troubles to respectable Egyptian families, as Hanan Hamed has shown. In the novel, promiscuous Sayyida is pitted against Layla, whose freedom from the confines of the home becomes tied to the freedom of the nation. In fact, the novel links the patriarchy of middle-class sensibility to complicity with the colonial presence. As Layla is breaking from old norms of middle-class respectability through her anti-colonial political activism, domestic work remains devalued and tied to immorality. When she finds love again in the figure of Hussein, it is tied to her duty to the nation. In a rare depiction of women rejecting hypocritical middle-class moralities as a happy ending, the last scene shows Layla leaving her family with its conservative beliefs. She runs after a train heading to Port Said full of volunteers, including Hussein, her new lover, to participate in the resistance movement against the tripartite aggression after the nationalization of the Suez Canal in '56. So this novel, which is actually considered a feminist literary manifesto, linked women's individual freedom to the collective national liberation, capturing the spirit of a new vision of post-colonial modernity where women became active participants in the political life of the nation. While the novel broke older taboos on women's role in the public sphere, it maintained conservative notions surrounding women's propriety and respectability at home, where domestic labor continued to be denigrated and devalued. This labor exerted in the production of life, almost exclusively done by women, is, in the words of Maria Mies, the perennial precondition of all forms of productive labor. Still, this seminal literary work continues to mark the country's collective memory of the relationship between a particular form of feminism and decolonization. In fact, through Arab socialism, state feminism, and third world solidarity, Egypt constituted its identity as a modern, post-colonial, and socialist nation state. Egypt, like other post-independence states in Africa and Asia, embarked upon a comprehensive legal, economic, and cultural program that consolidated the power and the political legitimacy of the post-colonial regime, and actually women were an essential component of this story. Women were granted the right to vote in 1956, and new labor laws iterated the principle of non-discrimination on the basis of gender. Women were entitled to 50 days paid maternity leave, and employers were forced to provide daycare if they employed more than 100 women. These legal changes happened. The state targeted the nuclear family as actually the foundation of national progress. Accordingly, as Mervat Haitham argues, the state under Nasser made reproduction a public concern. So women's liberation, or at least the state's idea of women's liberation during this period, was seen as necessary for building a new modern republican and anti-colonial nation state. In a 1958 article written by the Inspector of Art at the Ministry of Education, the author celebrates Mother's Day through depictions of motherhood in an ancient Egyptian sculpture whose artist depicts the child as part and parcel of the mother's body. And I quote here, as if the child has sprouted from the land that is her mother. The depiction of the fertile land and the nation as a mother in works of art is a common imagery used by nationalists. Beth Barron and other feminist writers have shown how Egypt was centered in the national imagination as a woman and a mother. While the imagery of the mother served the national consciousness, it effaced her labor at home, subsuming it under the elusive category of love. State feminism adopted the metaphor of Egypt as a mother to cohere the role of women as both active participants in the public sphere and as dutiful mothers serving the nations with their boundless love and devotion, not with their unpaid labor. Let me leave it here and have Sara continue on with the other novel we're going to be discussing today.
Hi, I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you so much, Elena, for organizing this, and thanks everyone for listening. And I'm just going to continue where I left off. I'm just going to show a few pictures. If I can open the PowerPoint. Okay, so basically what I'm going to talk about is the kind of political era and political project that came after the post-colonial state of that was built up around Nasserism, and this was basically the transition to the free market, or the transition to neoliberal restructuring in Egypt that happened in the late 60s and early 70s, so similar to many other places across the global South. And we've actually been talking quite a bit about kind of how this current moment, or the current pandemic, is really connected to some of the shifts that happened during this earlier era. So in particular, the privatization of public infrastructure like healthcare and education, but specifically the introduction of IMF and World Bank structural adjustment programs that took place in the 1970s. So what I want to talk a little bit about is how this transition to the free market, away from Arab socialism and this era during which social services were very much subsidized by the state, to this period during which privatization and a shift towards the private sector became really dominant. And I do this through a reading of a novel by Sonala Ibrahim called Zet, which was published much earlier, but actually was recently turned into a TV show during Ramadan in 2013, and so it was actually became quite a famous TV show during that period. So this is kind of a poster of that show. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both the novel and the show. And like I mentioned earlier, it was written by Sonala Ibrahim, who is actually a very particular writer in the history of Egyptian literature. I mean, he's very well known for his kind of communist and socialist leanings, and a lot of his work generally actually has these very strong themes related to Marxism and Nasserism. And so it's actually a really interesting novel because it does quite heavily focus on what happened to Egyptian politics and Egyptian society during this transition from kind of the post-colonial era to the era of the free market. And the reason we found this novel and this show really interesting is because they are very much focused on the kind of changing lives of a single family, and particularly actually a single woman, Zet, who was born on the day of the revolution in 1952. And the show itself actually goes up until the revolution of 2011. And most of the episodes and most of the chapters actually are focused on the space of the home and the space of the domestic. So it's a very fascinating lens into how these broader political shifts, which I'm going to talk a little bit about now, can actually be traced through the intimate sphere of the domestic, and in particular through kind of the changing tempo of social reproductive work that she has to do during this period. So just a little bit of background, Anwar Sadat became president of Egypt in 1971 and kind of is known for both this shift towards the free market that happened in 74 officially, but also of course for the peace treaty with Israel and the turn away from the Soviet Union towards the US and the West more broadly. What's really important, I think, for this particular presentation is that much of this project was very much on moving away from the public sector and instead making the private sector kind of the center of economic development and modernization. So what we see during this period is public education, public health care, and other forms of social services being cut very dramatically, and instead kind of new norms of entrepreneurship and new norms of individualism start to kind of play a much more central role. So Mirvat Hatem has written, quote, "With the retreat of the state as a social and economic agent of change, many official commitments to gender inequality were either ignored or abandoned. And young and particularly working class women bore the brunt of these painful economic and social adjustments that we see in the 1970s. And although the private sector opened up opportunities for particular types of women, so particularly women who already came from wealthy backgrounds, it's actually in the realm of benefits and things like job security, longer maternity leave, subsidized transport costs, childcare, and fixed working hours that we see a very dramatic difference between what the public sector offered, particularly women, and what the private sector did. So what we do in the paper is less look at what Infitah, or this transition to the free market, did or changed, but actually what it took away and what some of the gaps that were opened up during this period can tell us about the changing kind of tempo of social reproductive work. So the show itself, I mean, I could talk about the show forever because it's actually really such a great show, and it's on YouTube if you're interested. But the show itself actually, like I said, focuses on this woman who kind of many commentators have said is a kind of an everyday average Egyptian woman. And there's a lot to say about the symbolism, I think, of what that does. And it almost, again, uses this trope of a woman to speak about what's happening to Egypt more broadly. She goes to university and then drops out at some point to marry Abdelmajid, who's her husband. And then the show kind of charts their lives together up until the end. What I want to do is talk about two particular themes that come up in both the novel and the show that I think are really indicative of broader transformations that are happening in Egypt at that moment related to social reproduction. So the first theme that I wanted to talk about is the theme of work. And I think what's really interesting is that as we move from the 1960s into the 1970s, what we suddenly start to see in both the book and the show is that Zat is always working. And suddenly she seems very tired all of the time. There's this new kind of affect of depletion that takes center stage throughout many of the episodes during this period. She's in a constant state of movement and also in a constant state of tiredness. And her work outside and inside the home start to merge almost into one endless day. She actually has a job in the public sector. She works at a public broadcasting company. And what we see is that she comes home and then, of course, has to take care of the children, do laundry, cook, clean, and all other sorts of domestic labor. But actually with the 1970s, because of this new spirit of entrepreneurship and individual gain and so on, we also see that she starts to take on these small business projects as well, which she does within the home. So sewing or kind of buying little gadgets that she sells to people at work. So suddenly during this era, there's a lot happening, but also the show and the novel really show how she begins to embody the kind of exhaustion and tiredness that this creates. And there's one scene in particular where she says, "I'm 23, but I feel like I'm 50. And I think this particular theme of work, exhaustion, and kind of this feeling of depletion that she begins to really show is very closely connected to these broader economic shifts that are happening at this moment, whether that's the need for people to start working in both the public and private sector, the fact that now there's less support for childcare, or also the kind of pressure for many middle-class families to also become engaged in small businesses and kind of businesses that are run from the home and so on. So I think that theme actually really touches quite clearly on some of the major political and economic shifts happening at that time through this lens of the intimate. And the second theme that I thought was really interesting in the show that happens during this era is also actually this transition from a very strong and capable public sector to the sudden privatization of many kind of central spheres of life. So from the 1980s, we begin to see not only a decaying material infrastructure, so buildings start collapsing, bridges collapse, there's train accidents, and so there's suddenly this idea in the show that Egypt almost is collapsing somehow materially. But also we start to see massive discussions about private schools and the kind of pressure created through the need to pay private school fees. So whereas both Zat and Abdelmajid benefited from public schools, universities, and hospitals, their own children, and this is just one generation later, went to private schools because of the decreasing quality of public education. And actually, by the end of the show, Zat is the one who has to take on extra work to pay for their children's private school fees. So I think, again, through this lens of both public and material infrastructure, the show and the novel are really trying to show how there's increasing burden that was created during the 70s and 80s during this transition to a free market was particularly heavy for women and particularly fell on the shoulders of women. So just to conclude the discussion of this novel, I think many of the themes that come up throughout the novel and the show are really important lenses into how these kind of major or macro political and economic shifts can be traced through the space of the domestic or the space of social reproductive work. And we can clearly begin to delineate kind of what the effects of these transformations are beyond kind of what are more common discussions around economic growth or political democratization and so on. And so I'll just finish that part now. And before we finish the paper, I wanted to touch a little bit on some of the concluding thoughts we had to link what we've both just presented to the contemporary moment. I mean, I think one of the biggest connections is clearly the ways in which structural adjustment, so IMF structural adjustment and World Bank loans that were essentially forced on many global South countries in the 1970s and 1980s continue to really condition the ability of many countries to respond to public health crises. And particularly in Egypt, healthcare was one of the major public services that was targeted by structural adjustment in the 70s. And today, can really see not only the weakness or inability of the public health sector to respond, but also actually the access to private healthcare that is really granted to very few Egyptians, and this kind of very clear tiered system or access to healthcare that was created, I think, particularly during this moment. Connecting it to what May presented on, it's also really important to note the particular ways in which Egypt's labor market and the sort of over-reliance on the informal labor market plays out in crises like this. So domestic workers, for example, in today's Egypt, just like in Latifa Zayat's novel, are also not only held suspect, so they're often represented as bearers of viruses and microbes, but also their homes and neighborhoods are treated as laboratories for infectious diseases. But alongside that, many domestic workers, as many Egyptians who work in the informal market, have lost their source of income in light of the pandemic. And again, this focus or this emphasis on the informal labor market and broader kind of economic characteristics that have resulted from this history of colonial capitalism mean that for many countries in the global south, this choice of a lockdown or economic collapse becomes very astute for vulnerable populations that, again, in places like Egypt are really split along lines of race, class, and gender. And I think the last kind of connection we wanted to make to the present moment is, again, the ways in which a focus on national or state level responses to COVID-19 miss a lot of what's happening at the everyday level. And I think Brenna so beautifully pointed this out, but that what's happening in the home around care, what's happening at the community level is something that I think for many of us has become so clear and so crucial to the kind of response to COVID-19. And yet at the same time, we still see in a lot of discourse this focus on how countries are responding or how institutions are responding or not responding. And I think what we can take from what these novels offer us is how the everyday is very much central to the way we care and crisis. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay. See me? Thank you very much, both May and Sara. So as I said at the beginning, we will do now a short break. Since Liam, can you hear me? There haven't been questions collected so far via chat. Correct?
No, the chat has not been on.
No, that's right. No.
Okay,
Chat's
so
on.
I think we can take slightly shorter than 10 minutes and resume at 5:05.
Sure.
So we'll take a break of slightly less than 10 minutes and resume at 5:05 with questions and answers for the presenter. Yeah? Thanks.
And so if anyone has questions, if you could raise your hand by clicking the little person in front of the screen, and then we'll take a sequence.
I've also enabled chat, the chat function. So if people want to post messages, you can post messages as well now.
Hello, everybody. Back. Don't see
Liam,
any
I
hands.
can't see you.
Can you see any hands, Elena? Questions?
No, I cannot see any hand raised.
Okay, I'm going to raise mine.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we have Nellarine, and then we have Elena. Or Elena. Amit,
can you move them to presenter so that they can talk? Oh, fantastic. Hi, Nellarine.
Hi. Sorry I was late. I had another meeting I had to go to at 4.
No, thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Right, so sorry, is it, so I'm not sure of the order of questions, Liam.
You can go.
Okay, that's fine. So I only caught the second presentation that Maya and Sarah made. So my comments are related to this particular presentation, which I thought was really interesting and has got me thinking. So I'm very interested in colonial history. I've done a little bit on employment during the colonial and immediate post-colonial period in Pakistan, a little bit on Lebanon, but most of my focus is on Africa, in particular British West Africa. So, and I'm increasingly also looking at the links between the British Crown state and the actions that were taken commercially in British West Africa, and obviously in connection with that, the Americas. So I agree entirely with your comments regarding the World Bank and the fact that they have often created a change in direction or in terms of the policy, national policy, which in a way erodes some of the gains made during the immediate post-colonial period. But I'm also looking at things over a much longer period. I'm using a concept I've only been recently introduced to by a colleague of mine at University of Paris called a longue durée, which is really looking at the development of something by using some kind of tool or structure. And it seems that policy and law is a useful one to use. So the observations that I would make is that during, I'm very interested in what I call the peri-colonial period. So the period just before the colonizers leave, everything kicks off. There's a lot of local resistance and there's a kind of groundswell of resistance to the colonizers. The period, the post, if you like, the immediate post-colonial period and what follows on from that. What strikes me is how traditional forms or traditional views of the role of women in society persist either during this peri-colonial period. So if you look at what are the things that are priorities, what role women have actually in shaping the new country, the post-colonial country, it's interesting to see how long that lasts for and what kind of role they take in that transitional activity. I think that's really important because it'd be very easy to argue that forms of capitalism are what erode the gains made from post-colonial aspirations. But these post-colonial aspirations were very much that, I think, aspirations in the good sense, but also aspirations were not, which were not tested beyond national boundaries. So once one enters into a broader scenario, into markets which go beyond the state boundaries, then some of those aspirations are tested. So I think it's right to argue that there are aspects of capitalism and neo-capitalism that may affect the way that countries in the post-colonial era view women and develop expectations of women. But I think one has to be careful. I think many of the views of women in post-colonial societies very much mirror the views of women in pre-colonial societies also. So in other words, colonialism has almost frozen some of the views of what women are within societies in ways that maybe had it not been there, things could have evolved, maybe in a different way. So I can't hear you, Eleni.
I did
sorry.
mute myself, sorry. Thank you very much, Nalarin. Are there any questions? If you want to raise your hand before we give the, yes, Elena. Another Elena.
Hi, thank you very much, all of you, for wonderful presentations and thought-provoking. I'm sitting here trying to work, so it was kind of a nice interruption to trying to edit some work. But I have a question mainly for Brenna, but I think it might primarily because I'm not an expert at all in sort of post-colonial theory or Egypt, so I'm not able to kind of ask a question there. But Brenna, thank you for your presentation. I was thinking about the interesting way in which you articulated this porous boundary between public and private and domestic and public through a variety of workers and through also the legal immunity and biological immunity. So thank you very much for kind of that articulation. It was very interesting and very interesting in the way that you demonstrated how this accentuates or makes itself more visible now during COVID-19. And what I'm going to say is a little bit not anecdotal, and a question about the role of the state, which I think both presentations have. What I noticed is this retreat of the state at this moment, and its failure to immediately sort of act and provide demands that people wanted, either in and the call for volunteers or mutual aid groups to support it. So I wonder whether you had any thoughts about the role of mutual aid groups in the support or taking the place of the state. This is kind of a sort of a question. And also in terms of social reproduction, just from my little involvement in mutual aid groups here in Hackney, what I kind of noticed that all the labor of mutual aid groups is actually done by women. It's the women that are organizing, it's the women that are bringing the networks together to support vulnerable people in our communities. So I thought that's quite kind of, I was surprised, but not surprised at the same time witnessing it. And the other kind of point is when we think about workers, we're thinking mainly in relation to health workers, care workers, but there are other group of workers that perhaps can enter this conversation. And you mentioned performers, Brenna, but I was also thinking of sex workers as well, which are really suffering a lot. And their work, I guess, is considered even more private than other kind of jobs. So leave it there.
Thank you, Elena, also from Hackney, like me. Any other questions? If you want to raise your hand. If there are not other questions right now, I shall let the presenter answer this first round. May or Sara, do you want to go with Nalarin's question?
I think, do we have another question? Dalia?
Oh, yes, we do. Dalia.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, my question's really simple. Obviously like the question of women's work is we're often talking about social reproductive work, which is like really important. But I'm also interested in, when you look at particularly during Mubarak's time as president, and also like since, the sort of like the women-dominated textile factories and women textile workers seem to be like this recurring site of organization and some of the most effective labor organization in a context where organizing labor is really difficult because of the political context, that these textile workers that are predominantly women tend to be a particularly active site of dissent, and a kind of dissent that doesn't just hit at the industry and isn't just about kind of like workers' rights, but also has had a tendency to hit at the political nerve of the state. So I was just wondering if the panelists had any comments on kind of women's work in that kind of sense, and why that seems to be happening, and why that connection seems to be the case, and if that can be looked through through a gendered lens as work that is predominantly done by women but is not necessarily done in the private sphere, and why it kind of has that impact on the rest of the Egyptian political landscape in such a recurring way.
Thank you. Dalia? Any other questions? Doesn't look like for now. No. Okay. Do you want to go on? May or Sara?
Yes. I'm maybe I can try and answer the couple of questions, and if Sara has something else, she can continue. With regards to the first question, so there may be two things that I can say about that. One is, you mentioned something along the lines of just before the colonizers leave, the traditional roles of women persist. And that basically after somehow that colonialism have frozen some of the ideas that they kind of put forward. I mean, it's on the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, no. So, I mean, I've been working a little bit on Palestinian women before the Arab Revolt in Palestine, and during the Arab Revolt in Palestine in the 1930s, just before kind of Britain left, quote unquote, and specifically the revolutionary role that they have kind of put forward, despite how they might appear as traditional, and how they put the home as a space of resistance, a site of hiding. Similarly, in Egypt, similar things were happening, and even in the post-colonial moment, you have women kind of rejecting some of these inherited ideas from the colonial period that were kind of domesticated in different ways. So just like these ideas around women's respectability, for example, were domesticated nationally, capitalism was also domesticated in different ways. And so it's hard for me to say, like, how would these ideas developed if it wasn't for colonialism? But most certainly these ideas developed in parallel with and at the time of colonialism, be it on questions of labor laws, on sex work, as Elena has kind of pointed out, on questions of on queerness and sexuality. So many of the laws adopted during the colonial period were very much on the conservative side of things, and a nice link to that is Dalia's question on labor. I'm assuming you mean in Mahalla. Just a quick kind of background. So Mahalla is a town that's basically a factory town from the early 20th century, and it was and still is one of the central sites of labor resistance in the country, and actually one of the most important moments in the history of like workers' struggles was in 2006 when workers went on strike, and the strike was actually sparked by by women workers. They famously went to the men's section of the factory saying, here are the women going on strike, where are the men? And so obviously labor kind of operates on both levels, and struggle operates on both levels. And labor laws make it the case that women can go to the factory and do their labor under worse conditions than men, obviously, and then they can go home just in time to continue their reproductive work. And the reason why I thought the Mahalla link was interesting, because actually Mahalla during the colonial period, linking the second and the first question, was actually had a thriving red light district, for example, as the work of Hanan Hamed shows. And it was during the colonial period that we have all of these new laws surrounding women's sexuality and respectability that were carried on in the post-colonial period. Sara, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, no, I think I just wanted to add briefly. I think the idea of, I mean, they were both really great questions. I think the idea of things being frozen through either colonialism or shifts in capitalism is really important, because I feel like, as Maya was saying, I think there are these moments during which you start to see a lot of mobilization and a lot of radical resistance on the parts of women challenging actually, traditional roles and so on. Whether that's in the lead up to actually the anti-colonial revolution or military coup, or whether that's also during the 50s and 60s, during which I think also there was a very dominant socialist feminist kind of form of activism that then was frozen almost by this shift towards the free market. So I think it's really interesting to think about how both of these coexist, and that there are these there's a constant attempt to challenge some of these ideas about gender and sexuality and so on, but also how they can be very quickly paused or absorbed into other political projects. And I think, as we can see, these various political projects, although they're dramatically different from one another, all adopted some form of gendered nationalism that worked to really, I think, in many ways, de-radicalize quite radical movements. And I also, just to add, I think Dalia's question is really interesting as well. I think that to me, what was really interesting about what you said was precisely that actually those women-led strikes, I think in a lot of the literature and commentary on Egypt, are seen as just economic challenges, that they were just challenging workplace conditions. They weren't political, or they didn't go beyond kind of these individual factories. Whereas actually, like you're saying, I think it's important to think of them as very massive challenges to both political and economic power, and that in many ways they were some of the biggest challenges leading up to the 2011 revolution. And I think that that's largely kind of ignored when they're seen as, like you were saying, they're incorrectly labeled as kind of workplace grievances or just things happening in individual factories. And the other thing is, I think this stretches back again to a much longer legacy of socialist feminism in Egypt that I think sometimes becomes marginalized in the way we tell the history of gender in Egypt, where it's often actually much more through debates around modernity and tradition or labor, but not so much through actually there have been these histories of socialist and anti-capitalist feminist organizing in Egypt that continue. Thank you.
If I just may
Okay,
add
thank you.
a few just on what Sara was just saying, that actually women who led the textile strikes were actually calling for improvement in healthcare conditions in their neighborhoods and housing conditions, things that are deemed kind of outside of regular industrial demands. So they use the labor strike in a much more expansive sense, the way it should be used, actually.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Brenna, do you want to answer?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So thank you, Elena, for your question. I think that this, the point about the retreat of the state is spot on. And I'm thinking about the slide that I had with the quote from the Salvage editorial, commentary on one of their dispatches on COVID, where there's that phrase, still uneasy to abandon rentier capital. I mean, this is really where we see the state retreating and refusing to intervene in aspects of the economy that ought to be much more regulated, particularly in this moment. So, I mean, I talked about rent and housing, but we could also think about another form of rentier capitalism that is going to that is absolutely shameful, and that's the issue over patents. With UK and US pharmaceutical corporations not agreeing to put the research they're developing around a vaccine, into an open global pool that whereby any drug manufacturer could produce a potential vaccine at a low cost. I mean, there's all kinds of obscenities happening with government policy at the moment, and I think it's particularly more than concerning. I mean, it's particularly worrying and dangerous, given what's happening right now. So I think, I think that's a really important point to bring up. On the second point about I found it really interesting that even with this anecdotal, impression that most of the social reproduction that's happening with mutual aid networks is being done by women. I wasn't aware of that, and that also is interesting, because in this moment where initially we thought the state was stepping in to do all kinds of things that it has sworn it cannot do, like give wages to workers, etc., who are not being able to work right now, and all of these kinds of things, we see the retreat of the state in these areas where it really matters. Similarly, we see this really promising rise in mutual aid networks, but then we also see how the work itself has not been kind of degendered. So if we think about, what it means to work towards a kind of abolition feminism, or if we're thinking about, the meaning of social reproduction and that point about revalorization, or coming up with different conceptions of value altogether, then it seems like these would be, prime fronts upon which to do some political work. Now, I have to say, Elena started off the session by talking about this crisis of socially reproductive work, and I think what I've realized, just to bring it down to a very sort of personal, everyday level, that I'm sure a lot of people, listening in and attending are academics. I mean, we can see the failure of universities, even in this moment, to even acknowledge the socially reproductive work that is happening, with which we are contending. I find it phenomenal, like just unbelievable that I mean, never mind for reconfiguring our working lives right now to deal with the fact that we are not availing ourselves of any kind of commodified care work for the most part. So never mind about doing something more radical, there's even an inability to really acknowledge what's going on. So, you know, we are supposed to keep working as if we are not engaging in socially reproductive work. I mean, it's farcical. So, yeah, anyway, that was something by way of response.
Thank you. Thank you, Brenna. Any comments to that? Or other questions from the public? Any comments on the failure of universities that we are experiencing?
There's another comment from Eleanor in
Yeah.
the chat. She says, we are also seeing how states with women as leaders are able to reproduce care much better than states that don't have women as leaders.
Yeah, I wonder how would that be under Theresa May, though.
I think much better than Boris Johnson, but not ideal.
Yes, that's not very difficult, but
No.
I had a question for both of you, both of the presentation. I was wondering, in your article you mentioned briefly at the end the issue of global care chains and the importance. So sorry, this is to May and Sara in relation to Egypt, and the position of domestic workers there. I was wondering if you had any insight, if you could tell us within the current crisis, well, with the structural adjustment plans and now, how does Egypt places itself into these global care chains? Are there suppliers of care workers? Are there demanding care workers, or most probably both? And if you could tell us about, if you know anything about more about these global relations of social reproduction and the position of Egypt in that. And to Brenna, I have my question here. Yes, it was about the porousness of the body, which is a concept I really very much enjoyed, because I can refer very much to it from ecological perspective, and how we've been working a bit on how the materiality of the home, of the workplace affects labor, reproductive labor, or non-reproductive labor. So I guess this porousness of the body emphasizes a much clearer continuity, no, between the body and the home or the workplace, and both of their materiality. And I was wondering if this has any implication on value production or on processes of valorization, how, whether you're thought of linking the two, and whether this notion of porousness can expose a stronger understanding of processes of valorization or value production.
Yeah. No, you can go first, and then I'll go second if you like.
Okay. Yeah, just to that the question about the global care chains. I mean, I think we were interested in the paper in responding a little bit to the assumption in some social reproductive work around how gender and class, or gender and capitalism, kind of become the main intersections that are the focus of analysis. And we were thinking a little bit about how in reality, questions of nation, of religion, of race, of ethnicity also are really important to take into account, and how social reproductive work operates both globally and locally. So we touched a little bit in that article on the context of Egypt, but and building on work that's already been done in places like Lebanon and the Gulf states around the displacing of social reproductive work by women of a certain who come from kind of wealthier backgrounds onto domestic workers, whether they are Egyptian or domestic workers from other parts of the world. And so thinking a little bit with the critical feminist literature around global care chains and how it's really important to situate that displacement of social reproductive labor within flows of migration that are not simply about capitalism and patriarchy, but also very closely connected to an international division of labor that's racialized, and that's also a consequence of a colonial kind of world system. So thinking a little bit about also how domestic work, I think, is a sphere in which you really see both the global and local forms of hierarchy built around like racial capitalism come out quite clearly.
Thank you.
Okay. If I can just go, I just wanted to share, I just wanted to go back to one of the slides as a way of answering the question, if that's okay. I wanted to share, because I skipped over it because I got a bit muddled. So can everyone see that? The home is a site of contradictions. Yeah, I guess, and I don't know if Ale is still in the audience, but if she wanted to come in on this question as well about value. I mean, when I think about that, I think about the way in which labor in the home, which is also the site, as Ale and others have written about, is also the site for you know, different kinds of heavily exploited, feminized labor, and the blurring of the space of the home as a site of both, you know, the extreme exploitation of women's unpaid and paid labor, I think does directly relate to this question of value, most certainly. In terms of how we might relate that then to this idea of the porousness of the body and materiality as it relates to the environment and how that affects the idea of value, I think we can see quite clearly how that affects value within, you know, the realm of capitalist relations of labor, right? So this labor that's happening in homes, particularly those of you know, working class, overexploited women, is very much undervalued labor. But if we think about revalorization, then I think that leads us very directly into the kinds of questions around what it means to have a home, or what it means to have shelter that, you know, creates the conditions for, you know, living well and for being well. So I think for me anyways, maybe this just has to do with my limitations, but, you know, I think for me, that question of revalorization or reconceptualizing value when it comes to labor, both paid and unpaid, that's done in the home, you know, leads me to think then about property relations. And I think, you know, we can't really think about sort of labor without thinking about property, of course, and vice versa. So I'm not sure, I have to think about that question more, but I guess that's kind of how I see a bit of the connection there. I don't know if Ale is here, or she had anything to add, but yeah.
Thank you, Brenna. Any other questions? Or comments?
Just to flag that there was another comment in the chat from Irene saying, thanks a lot for the comment on universities' total invisibilization of women's working from home. That connects directly with the point in your presentation about the home being the center of the pandemics. When you have a home, by the way. And Alessandra said she has problems with connections, so she didn't really hear the last question, Brenna.
I'm just typing an answer out to her.
I can see Alessandra is in with twice, with 2 names. So, if there are no more questions, we can wrap it up. And yeah, sorry, I keep on seeing bubbles coming up. And I would like to thank you, these presenters, for joining us from London, from Cairo, and Liam and Amit, who have been working behind the scenes. Thank you very much. So we will post the links to the recording hopefully very soon, surely much earlier than 1 year, hopefully from next week. And Brenna, do you want, shall we, Liam, could you set up a Zoom link for an after presentation party with Farouz and Chris?
Yeah,
for
sure.
whoever wants to join.
Okay,
This was the agreement, the behind the scene agreement.
Thanks, Elena, for organizing, and Amit and Liam for doing all of this. Thanks a lot, and to Maya and Sara as well. Thanks.
Thank you all. Thanks, Elena.
Thank you.
So Liam, can you post it on the chat, and whoever wants to join can join?
I'm just doing it right now. Hold on.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thanks.